everyone to our webinar, Lateral Hiring in Hard Times. I'm Steve Nelson. I'm the executive principal for the McCormick Group, where I specialize in lateral partner recruiting, consulting, and also high-level professional staff recruiting. With me is Eric Dewey of the Dewey Consulting Group. Also with us is Dave Riss, who will be handling the slides and will be handling the Q&A as well. We will have Q&A at the end at about 50 minutes in. Please use the Q&A button to incorporate that. And we can go long. If we go over an hour, we may stay on if necessary. Our presentation is being recorded. It will be available on both of our websites, both the McCormick Group and the Group Dewey Consulting website. We will be producing an executive summary in the next few days, as well as a questionnaire. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Dewey to talk a little bit about the state of lateral recruiting.
Well, good morning, everybody. I appreciate you all showing up for the webinar. Just a little bit about my background. I'm the former CMO, and I've also been a practice administrator handling lateral recruiting. And back a few years back, when I was doing lateral recruiting, I was a little frustrated by the fact that there was just very little data on the partners that had brought clients over and just how much work was being brought over, how many clients and those kinds of things. So I talked to ALM, and they agreed that the information was necessary. So I created the original lateral partner recruiting survey. It's now in its second iteration, and there's some results that just came back out. So we're going to go over a little bit of the earlier data that was from 2015, 2016, and then the most recent data, which is 2019, and talk about a little bit about those changes that have happened in that. So if you would, Dave, let's go to the first slide. The current state of lateral recruiting. Actually, I'm sorry, the next slide. So one of the things that we've seen here is that the lateral recruiting, the average cost of recruiting, the fully loaded costs have gone up slightly. In 2015, they were 1.8 in the first year. Now they're estimated at 2.3 on average. This is data affecting the AmLaw 200. And over 2 years, which they looked at basically because of the guarantee is typically a 2-year time frame, that amount of investment is 4.2, and that's from the most recent lateral study between ALM and Decipher. The turnover rate, which was a major concern in our early look at the at lateral partner success, or the performance of lateral partners in new firms, was the fact that so many of them were leaving after 3 years or after 5 years. In 2015, that number was 50% that were leaving after the first 5 years. That's come down a little bit to about 40%. So it appears that we're getting better candidates or better fits for the culture. Interesting, of the firms that lost laterals within the 5 years, 74% of those cited personality and cultural reasons for the reason why they left. So we'll talk a little bit more about things that can be done to get a better fix on whether the candidate is a good fit from a personality and cultural standpoint. And most important on this slide, I think, is the idea that when we're looking at laterals that we're trying to use as a growth strategy, that is, we're acquiring a book of clients with that lateral, 62% of those laterals are underperforming expectations. And what's important to understand here is that when we talk to law firms about what was their expectation for the book of business, they have already discounted the total value of that book by 30 to 50%. And so this 62% of the underperformance underperforming is really a pretty significant number. I was also on the phone with Patrick Fuller from ALM a few days ago, and they're working on a new study with lateral recruiting. And he shared with me one of the newest findings they found was that female laterals leave about a year earlier than the male laterals. And I asked him why he thought that was, and he said, well, it's possibly because they get less guarantee or whatnot. But again, you know, as diversity issues are becoming more and more important in our industry, and being sure that everybody gets an equal chance at all the opportunities, we may need to really track carefully how all the diversity candidates are doing in our lateral recruiting program. Steve, you guys did a study recently to try to gauge the impact of COVID-19. So would you go over those findings?
All right. Yes. First of all, I do want to stress some more data we got from AmLaw, the AmLaw Compass program. Lateral partner hiring, according to them, was down 38% in the March-April period in 2020 versus 2019, obviously because of the difficulties with regard to COVID-19. And the preliminary statistics that we're getting for May indicate a very similar percentage decrease in the number of lateral hiring. In addition to that, we conducted a survey, both of the members of our lateral recruiting roundtable that we hold 3 times a year on a virtual basis, plus participants in this survey were given an opportunity to respond. So that statistic, that survey indicates that 75% of the firms right now are actively recruiting partners and groups. 25% are not. And of the 75% that say they are, 75% of those saying that they are being more conservative than they were in the past. So that's indicating that, you know, really the percentage of firms that are looking at this as business as usual, around 6%. 44% of the respondents have said their firm has lost a candidate due to COVID-19 considerations. Obviously, there are a lot of different situations that could come up that would explain that. And then the other thing that I think will be interesting and will play out in the months to come is that 2/3 of our respondents said that the firm has cut back salaries or hold back draws for partners. And of those firms, this 61% are asking laterals to honor those cuts, and that will raise some issues, particularly if a lateral is coming from a firm that didn't cut salaries. What are they going to do when they go to another firm? So, given that, I thought that we focus a little bit more on the impact of what we see the impact of COVID-19 from the long term. The prolonged recession, I think, is going to increase, firm closures, more mergers. I think that it will give aggressive firms, the pick of the litter in terms of, getting new candidates, and therefore they will, aggressive firms will probably, and certainly the aggressive firms that are doing well will do better. In addition, I think the dispersed workforce means the culture is harder to maintain. It may lead to more dissatisfaction within law firms, and then would lead to more candidates considering moving elsewhere. I think marginal producers will be given less runway given the state of the economy. I think right now there's an increased client resistance on firms, on lawyers changing firms in the short run. I think that'll eventually change. It'll be the way it has been. But firms will be more risk averse, more conservatives, and they're, I think that there'll be a higher bar for partners trying to make a move to another firm. At the same time, because of the economic situation, there'll be more candidates on the market that would be classified as risky. Candidates that don't have a large book of business or have had their business been decreased over the last year or two, or there might be more red flags, so to speak, in the market. And then I think one of the things that I think will result in this is that firms not only have to look at the lawyer's book of business, but they're going to have to look at the clients themselves as to whether that client is going to thrive in the years to come. because it doesn't make sense, you know, for them to bring in a new partner if the client goes bankrupt or, you know, gets sold or, you know, is that if there's any instability in that client relationship, it's likely not to help the firm. So Eric will,
All right, let's talk about.
yeah. Oh, okay. So want to talk a little bit about the areas of practice
Right.
that are expected to grow. And these are this is the list of firms of practice areas that industry commentators have talked about. Bankruptcy obviously being the most obvious, but some other areas, obviously healthcare, labor and employment, insurance, those have all been mentioned. And those commentators also think the corporate will contract along with IP in some areas and real estate. However, our survey indicated something a little different. The #1 practice area of need, according to the survey respondents, is still corporate. And I think that's largely because, I mean, corporate is a large practice area, but it's also the engine that often drives the cross-selling of other practices. And therefore, the corporate practitioners are often in demand, not just for their, you know, what they do and what their book of business is, but for the ability to drive other work from those clients in other areas. So I think that's still, right now, I think corporate is still in demand, and that may be contrary to what we're hearing in the press. Other areas that the survey indicated were of interest are litigation and healthcare and FDA. You know, those are sort of in line with what the industry commentators say. So that said,
all obvious practices where people are looking for FDA with biotech and biopharma and whatnot growing. Let's talk about what these changes and the COVID changes really mean. And what we're proposing here is that firms are taking a wait and see position right now with what's going on. It's more competitive right now. There's more volatility in the market. There's more risk associated with lateral recruiting right now. And so we believe now is really a good time to take a step back and evaluate your lateral hiring program, particularly in terms of what is your strategy and whether you're delivering on the strategy and whether you have those tools in place to deliver on your lateral growth strategy. And the second is, are you attending to every aspect of the process? Are you managing the various stages of the lateral recruiting life cycle? And then lastly, are you getting the quality of the candidates that your firm should be getting, and what can you do to improve those? So most of what we're going to talk about today is really about strategy. How do you implement tools? About some ideas for interviewing and some due diligence ideas, and also managing sources of candidates and making sure that you're getting top quality candidates. Steve, we both looked at a lot of different lateral recruiting programs, and certainly when I did the research with ALM, we had an opportunity to talk to dozens of firms that had fairly sophisticated lateral hiring programs, mostly among the AmLaw 200. There were some consistent themes that came out in terms of weaknesses in programs. You want to tell us about some of them?
Yeah, right. I would really classify them in 4 main buckets. So one is the lack of strategic focus. You know, are you really following a strategy? Does it fit within the firm's strategic plan? Are you bringing in the right kind of candidates? Are you pursuing the right kind of candidates? The second would be the sourcing of candidates. Are you effective at reaching out to the candidates that really make sense for your firm? The ones that are that fit best from a strategic point and are the ones who can be, can give you the most bang for the buck. The third would be your process. Is your process the type of process that will both give you the information that you need to make a good decision, yet at the same time, keeping the candidates interested in your firm, the ones you really want. And then finally, the whole due diligence process related to the process itself, but due diligence as a deeper dive in exactly what you're doing to to figure out, is this the right person for your firm? And we're not just talking about due diligence based on book of business, but it's due diligence on a whole variety of attributes that these candidates will have. And so I think Eric will talk about the first of these, the strategic focus, starting right now.
Yeah, so there's a saying that culture eats strategy for lunch. And it's true that the best strategy may not be able to overcome a culture that works against that strategy. So one of the main points I think we want to talk about here is that, you know, as that statistic indicated, where you're turning over laterals, and that the biggest reason why you're turning over laterals is the fact that they're leaving because the personality or cultural fit didn't work between them. You can't really have a successful strategy unless you're not also paying attention to, is the strategy aligned and synergistic with the culture of the firm? And so much of what we'll talk about today is making sure that not just the expertise and the client book are what you're going after, but your strategy also includes other aspects for recruiting these laterals. So to just provide some context to the discussion, this next slide, Dave, outlines the phases of the lateral recruiting process. We call this the life cycle of the lateral recruiting process. And this was identified in the first survey that we did with ALM, and it essentially looks at the main phases, but also, you know, ironically, it also reveals areas where there's significant improvements that can be made in the process. So not only are a lot of firms just kind of taking opportunities as they're presented to them, and in which case we think a more strategic approach needs to happen, but they often haven't developed a robust sourcing of candidates, either by through search firms or you know, talking to their clients. And then the due diligence process has been, you know, it varies quite a bit from firm to firm. We'll show how that works. The pre-hire, the offer stage, how they come up with the guarantee and what the expectations are, and the negotiation of that package is an area that we can look at in future. The integration is also an area where there's a lot of opportunities for looking at cross-selling and the plan B of a candidate, and we can look at that at future webinars and whatnot. And the other aspect that we'll touch on this, and probably in every webinar that we do, is the evaluation process, both looking at the total evaluation of the process and each stage of the process, but also evaluating the process as it applies to each individual candidate, whether you brought them in and whether they stayed, or even those that you've missed. So Steve, the first step in really looking at the recruiting process is to gather data. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about the kinds of information you would want to base that situational analysis on.
Right. So we would recommend that you go back 10 years and review all of your laterals, you know, and you've got to slice it and dice it in a lot of ways. I mean, you got to look at practice group, you got to look at industry, you got to look at office. And certainly you have to look at diversity. How have you done with your female lawyers that have come in, and how have you done with minority groups? The source of candidate, you know, was it from a search firm? Was it something that you worked on internally, et cetera? And then where did the candidate come from? Law firms are, of course, the greatest percentage of where these candidates come from, but most firms are also bringing people either in from government or for industry. You'll want to take a look at that and see how that's worked. And then you track the level of business, you know, year by year as to how they have done. But you've got to go beyond the originations and the book of business. You really got to look at how how people have performed in other ways. Are they creating value in terms of being, you know, a skilled attorney to support other partners in, you know, in key matters? Are they good citizens? Things like that. So So it's a very detailed kind of exercise. And there's one other thing that you've got to do, which is you've got to review your significant misses. And those come in really two categories. One is the candidates that you interviewed and couldn't, you didn't land, figure out why and, what could have been done differently. And then the second would be the candidates that you would have wanted to interview and you never had the chance. And so therefore, this is a very complex kind of exercise. And you also have to look at, in terms of the people who's left, you've got to also evaluate the reasons they left. There are situations where they leave the firm, but it might be positive for the firm. If a partner has gone to a major client or a would-be client and picked up some additional business, not a bad thing. So this all has to be reviewed. And once you get that data together, Eric will talk a little bit more about how you want to evaluate it. You've got the data, now figure out what do you do with it.
Yeah, so you've got some data on your laterals. The next step is really to step back and look at, are the practice needs being met? Are your client needs being met? We advise looking at four main areas. The people, do you have the right people in place to manage the lateral recruiting process in each of the various types of roles they need to have? Do you have a defined process in place, not just overall, but also do you have processes defined for due diligence, for instance, or how the integration process is gonna unfold? Then do you have tools that are effective and that are efficient? And then lastly, experience. Are you gathering the data and looking back at how you're managing the process and trying to improve each step of the process? We're going to talk a little bit about some ways that you can do that. But of course, when you're looking at this process, each of these areas really deserve to have some pretty tough questions asked about each of the areas, specifically in managing risks. I think from what I've seen, the vast majority of lateral failures, when firms look back, it was either because they didn't really do a very good job on the due diligence, or they just hired him because of a recommendation that one of the attorneys had. And there was some confidence bias that distracted them from some of the red flags that they might have seen otherwise. Let's talk briefly about strategies, Steve. You and I sat together and tried to figure out some different strategies that lateral programs have had that we've seen.
Right. So this is really, okay, here's the reasons why you are bringing in laterals. What purpose are they going to serve for the firm? The most common of which is the mix-in, what we call the mix-in, which is, this is something you're building strength on strength. You've got a very strong practice area, but you want to make it even stronger. Maybe you want a different nuance to the practice that you don't have. So that's very common, and also relatively common is what we call the bolt-on, and that is a situation where you want to bring in an adjoining practice. We look at it as if you have a jigsaw puzzle and you've got your corner pieces in place. What are the next best contiguous pieces that you should be adding so that you can add practice areas or industry groups that fit within, what you're already doing and are the next, sort of the next logical step, and where you might actually get some new opportunities because you're already strong in the area, and therefore, you're bringing a, 1 + 1 = 3. And then there are the other reasons that you want to bring people in, add to your bench. Clearly, there is a major effort on diversity that we've seen over the last few years, and that's going to only increase with the events over the last few weeks. That's important. That's going to be important for you and your firm and the clients and everybody else. So you've got to be working on that. And then there's succession planning and other reasons. The other one I want to focus on is new competencies, because that is really more about bringing in attorneys that maybe are looking at practice a different way. They are bringing in, a particular use of technology that's very innovative, that will be the practice of the future. So those are things that you got to look at as well. Is, you know, are we bringing in the type of people with the type of skill set that will, you know, make the firm stronger from an overall perspective in the
You know,
years to
this
come?
is important,
Anyway,
really,
that's,
because it, sorry, Steve.
yeah, no, I was just going to say that,
Yeah,
then to take a look at this, you know, from a standpoint of your strategy maps and your scorecards of how you can actually determine how you're doing.
yeah. The strategy that you select really drives a number of elements on down, that cascades down through your process. So setting up a specific strategy for what you're trying to accomplish enables you to really kind of map out what it is that you're trying to do. The balanced scorecard was introduced a couple decades ago now, I guess, by two Harvard business professors, Norton and Kaplan. And they developed the balanced scorecard process, which essentially looked at four main areas that are required to be dealt with to manage change and progress in an organization. And those areas where you have to know what the financial results are that you're trying to achieve. You want to know how you're going to affect the clients and what value you're creating for clients. Then you need to know those key initiatives and what tasks you're going to do to be able to manage those. And you need to know what you need to know to manage those tasks. So there's a learning and growth component to it. And from the balanced scorecard, they developed what's called a strategy map. And the strategy map is really just a simple graphic. It's typically just one page that shows a logical cause and effect between the strategic objectives and the initiatives and learning that needs to be done in the firm. And it allows you to communicate pretty clearly what it is you're trying to accomplish in the firm. And so everybody can be on the same page and everybody knows what their role is in doing that. So if you've done a strategy for the Lateral program, you may put it through the process of doing a strategy map to make sure you've covered all your bases. But then from the strategy map, if that cascades down into a scorecard. So the next slide, Dave, shows what a scorecard. We've just made some kind of, these are edited, so to speak, just to be able to get them on the slide and whatnot. But again, you have the financial results you're trying to achieve, the customer results you're trying to achieve, the internal processes that need to be implemented to achieve those objectives, and then the learning and growth criteria, which you don't see on this slide. So you have objectives, and each objective may have several different initiatives that you will map out to assure that you accomplish those objectives, and then measurements that you can use to make sure that you're making progress on each of those initiatives. It's a way to really focus the effort to ensure that you know, any changes you're making to your lateral recruiting program are being done in a way that they're measured and you know exactly where you stand and what you still need to accomplish, and everybody can see. It's a very transparent process, so everyone can see what's being done and monitor the progress towards that. Firms probably have similar tools that they're already using. I just encourage that they use the principles of the balanced scorecard because it ensures that the learning and growth components are also developed, not just initiatives. We assume everybody knows what to do once they know what the initiative is, but those learning and growth modules help you identify where you need outside help, what other departments may need to participate in the project. So a variety of different benefits that you would get from using this. Steve, once you have your plan and you know what initiatives that you're gonna try to, now's the time when you can begin to identify, okay, who is it that we're actually looking for? And this candidate profile is a great tool, I think.
Right. Yeah. And this can be, you know, this is a way to evaluate, you know, each candidate that comes through the door. Obviously, you're going to need the legal expertise. That's table stakes. You know, that you absolutely need. And then, depending on the situation, the client book may be very important, and we would need to know that. We need to know how's it working with industry. I want to focus a little bit on the right-hand side of this slide. The management and supervisory skills, that's really the management of people. And, it's the typical, one thing you want to avoid is the screamer. And this would go to that, and the idea of, can this person manage efficiently the people that they're going to have to work with, whether they're partners, counsels, associates, paralegals, staff. And then on the bottom of this is process and matter management. Little different. That's really more about, is this lawyer thinking about, the matters from an efficiency standpoint? And I think the example that we run into a lot would be the partner with a big book of business, but doesn't have the management skills. And then all of a sudden you get to the end of the year and you see, well, there's a lot of revenue here, but not much profit. That should be looked at to see, is this person going to be profitable, not just revenue generating? Then finally, the cultural and personality traits. Obviously, that's really important to the firm. Firms say it all the time when we talk to them, is that we don't want any jerks here, et cetera, et cetera. But one caution on the cultural and personality traits, because I think that firms can get tripped up because they take a primarily white male view of their culture. And you've got to make sure that the personality traits and the culture traits are really focused on a diverse firm, not just what you've done for the last 20 years. So moving on beyond that, I want to talk a little bit about basically the value propositions. Dave, can you, right. So this is, you've now figured out what your strategy is. You want to start to figure out, okay, how do we go about recruiting? And the first thing you got to do is you've got to figure out your value proposition. Whether you're doing it yourself or you're using a recruiter, the value proposition is the business case for the combination. We find that it's really important to use your marketing professionals during this process because they know how to do value propositions for clients. They've been doing it for years and they've been doing it effectively. And so we don't see the marketing professionals really involved that much in organizing your value proposition for laterals. And so that's something to think about. Another thing is on value propositions is the different candidates, you might have different value propositions for different candidates, because the value proposition is one candidate might be focused totally on platform, and where there might be some really great client opportunities, they're being held back because the firm doesn't, the clients don't know who their firm is. That's one aspect of it. But then you've got other candidates that are getting priced out. They've got major issues with regard to their rates, and sometimes it conflicts. And so therefore, you have to be able to establish the right value proposition for the type of candidate you're looking for. So I would say the other couple of things I want to emphasize here is, one is that look at things that that are unique to your firm from a cultural standpoint or a benefit standpoint. Things like, do you have a sabbatical program? One thing to look at is, what are the roles that laterals play in your firm? We run into people, candidates who are concerned about going to a firm which has been, has not hired many laterals and has not elevated those laterals into management positions. And then you also want to look at things related to your compensation system that may be a plus. We've worked with a couple of firms that do not track originations by attorney, or they have a unique situation as to how they track the originations. Those are important. It gives you an idea of how you're valuing them, and that's something you got to look at when you're putting together your value propositions. So you've done your value propositions, and now you're ready to go out and recruit. Now this chart is a chart that ALM and Group Dewey did in 2015. It shows the state of the market with regard to how how partners are recruiting, where they're coming from. We don't think this has changed very much, over the last 5 years. You can see 48%, the highest percent is coming from outside recruiters. 40% are coming from personal recommendations from partners within the firm. Another small percentage is 4% is coming from in-house, probably from other, professionals within the firm. And then 8% is other, and, I'm not sure where that is. Part of that probably is clients, and we think that there's a missed opportunity that firms are having with regard to using their client feedback programs to ask their clients about the other, the other great service providers that that company uses. I mean, there are definitely some firms out there that do this very well, and their clients actually call up the lawyer and say, maybe you ought to go to firm X. That's what you want. You want to have that relationship with your clients so that they're going to support you on that, and they can give you a lot of insight. So moving on to the recruiting part of this. You may think, I've talked about earlier about, we think there's an over-reliance on computers, and you may think, well, you're a recruiter, why are you saying that? And I'm really talking about, when I talk about that, I'm really talking about what we would call the wish list type of recruiting. This is where the firm calls in multiple headhunters, tells them what they're looking for, sends them out, really doesn't do anything else, and the firms sort of come back with various people here and there. So it's really, those recruiters, are acting a lot like mini sports agents. They're really focused on finding talent in the marketplace. Sometimes that can be very valuable. We find that's very much the case with government lawyers. Government lawyers have ethical issues that sometimes, make it difficult for them to do their own searches. And it's good for, people for in-house as well. It could be very helpful in certain situations with partners from law firms. But you've just got to remember that in that method of recruiting, a lot of times those recruiters are going to end up focused on candidates that have to move. And candidates that have to move, a very large percentage of them have to move for not very positive reasons. So what we're advocating is really having a dedicated set, a very small set of search firms that you use for your strategic needs, and that you're working with them in a partnership to actually help get you the people you really need, where there's a lot of interchange of information. You're looking, there's not one of this us versus them type of situations. And the other thing that type of relationship with a search firm will give you is feedback from recruiters on the market position and perception. A lot of times, a firm may run into trouble because 5 years ago, there was a scandal and people are still talking about that. And even though it's ancient history. And so therefore, your firm, you need to know that that's going on and that you can counteract that type of information that may be in the marketplace.
Yeah. One other point on that slide is that, when I started eLegal Training, which is the remote associate business development training company that I have, I formed an advisory board of people from different walks of life that could help advise me on setting up this virtual training platform. And it would seem to me that would make a lot of sense too for the lateral recruiting programs to look beyond the firm to some of their top clients to get the input from them on the kinds of lawyers they'd like to see the firm add, the disciplines of those, what kinds of core competencies those lawyers should have. And so that you have more than just the search firms, that you're using your internal resources, but you're also using your clients and other external resources to help formulate the best strategy to move forward. On the process, once you do find a candidate, this is from the latest ALM study, there are a lot of different things to check. And again, having a good process in place helps you make sure that you've checked all these things and you can report that these things have done. You can see there's a fair amount of variety in terms of how often people are doing these aspects of the vetting process. I would point out here that psychometric testing, which is basically a personality test, is done very infrequently. But when you think back to the study that was done that showed 74% of those laterals that left the firm left because it wasn't a good personality fit or a good cultural fit, this is something firms should probably look a little bit more carefully at. I know I do a lot of work with growth play. I'm a consultant with growth play in addition to Group Dewey Consulting. And we have a personality test called the Chally assessment. And we can test a group of lawyers and get a pretty good idea for, you know, the cultural orientation, if you will, of those attorneys. And that then can be used, again, just another data point, an objective data point, because otherwise you're sitting down and you decide whether you like somebody or don't like somebody, and that influences whether or not you want them to be hired. And there's a lot of confidence bias. You know, you can be really good at first impressions, but down the road when there's stress and when there's, you know, you're working together in a team, that's when you really start to get to know person's personality. So the more tools that you have at your disposal to understand the cultural fit and the personality fit, the better off you'll be. In talking about the interviewing process, next slide, Dave, I think Claire Essex made a really good point, and that is that we talked about developing an interviewing team and having a consistent core group of people that really manage the interviewing process. So they're the ones, they look at the LPQ, they identify what aspects of that information that's provided that they want to validate or dig more deeply into, and then they develop a strategy to interview the candidates and have people focused on specific areas of information that they want to get. You may have the marketing business development person kind of assessing the candidate's business development capabilities in case they don't bring their clients over. But, you know, Claire's point is, who's on that interviewing team? Is that team reflecting the firm and where you want to go? And is it a diverse group of people that are representing the firm in the interviews? And yes, we will send the slides out. We'll also have this recorded on both of our websites. Just answering a question whether these slides would be presented. Yes, we will share the slide deck with all participants. We're going to follow up, just side note here, housekeeping. We're going to follow up with a executive summary and a short survey we hope you'll complete, which will give us some input on future topics that you'd like covered. So regardless, the idea here is that you have a process associated with the interviewing. When I was doing it, what I noticed was, oh, he's going to be in this practice area, but let's get this rainmaker to talk to him and 3 or 4 different people, and you'd set up a day of interviewing with them. But there wasn't really any rhyme or reason as to why that person was doing the interviewing and what they were trying to get out of the candidate and understand with that candidate in that interviewing process. So a more regimented, more disciplined process will make a big difference in trying to reduce the amount of churn and increase the amount of clients that are coming over. Steve, how might this look? I think we laid out some of the responsibilities by participants.
Right. So the idea is that you want to put together your team of lawyers and your recruiting personnel and other staff within the firm, and focus on the strengths that those people bring to the table. Obviously, the issue of legal skills, that's going to be the province of your attorneys. Some of the other things, business development assessment and psychometric testing, that's probably more on the staff side. I'll say one other thing with regard to that, and this really goes into, the third bucket, which is, you've got, many firms have some great practice management people who run, the practice groups, and they can be really helpful with regard to analyzing the person's practice, in terms of how they run the practice and so forth, because every day they're analyzing, your own firm's practice and how it's the efficiency of how it's being run. So the idea is it's both, primarily a lawyer responsibility, primarily staff, but also a lot of interplay where both of those groups will work together. So let's talk a little bit more about process in general. Next slide, please. And I want to make a couple of points here. The most important point is that you've got to remember that when you're doing the interview process, you're not just evaluating that person's skills, abilities, personality, et cetera, but you're still trying to sell them on your firm. That you're in a contest, and you want to make sure that that they are still interested in your firm. And so it's important for you to always remember that, and so that you don't go through the Spanish Inquisition with your candidates. I'll say one thing is if everything else is equal or even close to being equal with regard to a contest for a lateral, invariably the firm that wins out is the one that treats them the best and shows them the love and gives them a hint as to what the culture really is within the firm. So I think that's very important. I think another good point is include your marketing and business development team early in the process and the middle of the process at the end. They can be helpful in a lot of different ways. And then the other point, which is really related to my first point, is make sure that you explain the end game process with the lateral when they reach the final stages of your process. Because at that point, the lateral is undergoing a lot of stress and anxiety. They want to come to your firm. They're going through a process. They're trying to practice law in the meantime. And the end game can be really harrowing for them. And if you don't explain to them the exact steps with regard to referencing, background checks, client, the conflict checks, the various committee votes and the partnership votes, if you make a misstep at that game of the process, it can be fatal. And I don't know how many times I've heard the situation come up where we get a call from a firm that says, "Oh, we want the lateral to come in and meet one more partner." Well, that should have been worked out in advance. If you do that, you're showing yourself in a very bad light. So
yeah.
let's
Another tip on just going back to what Steve was saying. It's really beneficial to have a single person sit in on every interview with the specific job responsibility of prompting the two attorneys who are meeting to talk about their clients and what opportunities there may be, what synergies there may be between their practices, and then capture those and get those into the integration plan early. It's really surprising how much they talk about different opportunities. They get excited about the lateral coming into the firm, but they forget to really write those things down, and everybody's really busy, and those opportunities are just missed out on. So having somebody who can sit in on the interviewing process and with the purpose of capturing the opportunities and documenting them so that they can be followed up on is something that can really get the integration going quickly in the beginning stages, which is important.
Okay, so
all right, we're wrapping up on our time. Let's go through these kind of quick, Steve, so we can give some time to questions. I know I've got at least one or two here.
All right. So, I think we can just, most of this is on the screen. These are things we've talked about before, concentrate on strategic hiring, developing unique propositions, have some sort of, process to evaluate what you've done, those kinds of things. We've got more recommendations as well. Next slide, please. Consistent interviewing teams and roles. We just spoke about that. Involving your marketing and business development professionals. Again, building intelligence and employing recruiters proactively, not reactively.
I think that one's critically important. Every step of the process can have a metric that gets measured. And the more you're able to drive the lateral recruiting process with having the data to guide your efforts, the better off you're going to be and the faster you're going to be able to make improvements in the program.
Right. Okay. So along those lines, we want to talk about, how a recruiting program assessment could really help your firm. And I want to start on that with really the proposition that your lateral partner recruiting program can be a life or death situation with your firm. It can bring you a lot of revenue and a lot of profit. And, I know that firms are doing a lot of work on marketing and BD to do that, the very same thing, but I would venture to say you've got a better opportunity to do that with your lateral hiring program as well as your marketing. I'm not saying, don't, I'm not at all saying that you should stop with marketing. I'm just saying that there is a value add to your lateral recruiting program that, it's, important to add to your revenues. It's easier to buy it than build it. Let's face it. So, so the idea is that, that you need somebody to come in and really evaluate, have that jaundiced eye towards what you think you're doing right and what you think you're doing wrong. Have somebody come in and help you manage that process and help you on the road to improving your whole program. So,
the money's big. Not only are you spending a lot on laterals, but the book of business that is potentially able to come over, having a really good idea in terms of which clients are going to come over, which ones you want to focus on that are the best opportunities. Those things can add revenues to the firm pretty quickly and really produce an incredible return on investment. All right. Thanks, Steve. Enjoyed presenting with you.
Right. I want to make, before we take questions, I want to make one other point. I had made reference to the lateral partner recruiting roundtable that we hold. Anybody who's on the line who is in a law firm in a recruiting capacity can join. Just drop me a line and you will be added to the list. We've always, even back in pre-COVID days, we did this, we did some in-person, but there was always, telephone or Zoom access to our meetings. So we'll be doing that, in the future, whatever way we can.
Yeah. So we've got a question here. I'm going to start. I've got a couple questions. So let me read the question. This is, I'm not sure who this is from, but this person said, "This has been a very insightful presentation. I'm curious if you've seen other firm recruiting personnel implement these practices successfully with firm leadership, and if so, if you have any quick best practices you recommend for convincing firm leaders to adopt a more, I guess that's intuitive recruiting approach." So yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at, I think the place to begin is to do an assessment of the program, to say, look, this is the amount of money that we've been putting into this. This is what we expected to get in terms of a return on investment. And this is what we're actually producing right now. And here are several different areas that we think we're falling down in that, if fixed, would be able to turn that around. So there are so many different ways that you can break this up and work on pieces of this. And I'm also seeing that Thompson Co. has done a number of these. Coburn has, it flashed on and off too quick, that they've done a number of these improvements. The person that asked this question, get in touch with me and I'll tell you who the attendee was from that firm if you want to connect with them.
Let me address the first question. I think it's really important, that you can have that conversation with the leadership of the firm, that the people involved have that conversation and make the case that this is really critical to your firm, and that you're not just, an administrator, sort of handling, recruiting duties, that you're the strategic, that this is a strategically important aspect of the firm, and that you're somebody who, that is there to really help the firm. And so I think it's largely about, going into that managing partner and so forth, and not being afraid to tell them what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah. Another question from Claire Essex. I've faced two challenges as a senior business development professional when integrating new laterals. The first, their expectations regarding what the book of business the firm will provide them, and two, how quickly they'll get up to speed and start performing. The internal expectation appears to be 3 to 6 months. What advice do you have to manage these expectations? And again, this is a great question. It is important to manage expectations. I think as marketing and business development and professional development people, our job is really about managing expectations. When you have the data, when you have metrics that you've developed and you begin to track, it's no longer really guessing or somebody saying this is how fast it needs to go. You actually know every step of the process and how much time each of these steps take. Regarding the first question, that's difficult because the amount of work that gets imported or exported out of a candidate's portfolio or any particular attorney's portfolio depends on the level of trust that they have with that other person, and that trust takes time to build up. It's difficult for an attorney to turn over a significant amount of client work to another attorney that they haven't actually seen in action. So the promise is difficult, but what you can do is go through, I have a document I use, it's a cross-selling, I forget what the name of the document is, but it's essentially a cross-selling assessment, and you can look at each client of the firm and ask a series of questions that can help you dial in on what are the best cross-selling opportunities, not just from the practice synergy standpoint, but also from the strategic importance of the work and what have you. You don't want to start out trying to promote a lateral to working on highly strategically important work for another attorney's client. You want to be able to slowly embed yourself in that attorney's client's work. And there are a series of things that you can look at to help narrow the thinking about where are the best opportunities, which are the attorneys that are most likely to be able to share work or willing to share work. And that's all part of a really thoughtful business development, business case and a business plan that gets done. And another reason why I think the marketing and business development people need to be early on in the whole recruiting process, because not only can they capture opportunities, but they tend to be in a position where they see what's going on in all of the different practice areas, and being able to see the process from start to finish allows them really to be able to implement some of those things more quickly.
All right, so there's another question we have here. What is the best way to get the word out to the marketplace that your firm is interested in recruiting laterals? Well, this goes to, I think, our discussion earlier. I do think that is a place where you do want to reach out to multiple recruiting firms, I would do that. Have lunches with them. Of course, these days that's hard to do, but bring them in, talk to them about your firm and its needs, but don't just say we're interested in these areas. You got to make that case that we talked about in the value propositions, the reason why laterals will come to your firm. So that's number one. That's the first part of it.
And what's in it for the clients.
Right. And the other part of it, though, is also, that's where having a dedicated recruiter is important, because you've got no assurance. If you do what we call the wish list, there's no assurance that those recruiters will really reach out very deeply into the market. They're going to call people they know, and people they've placed before, things like that, and they're not going to really get to the marketplace. Where you can really get some additional value add from your recruiters is that they can go out there and they can talk to they can try to reach everybody out there and tell your story. And even if they don't come over to your firm, at least your story is getting out there. And then in a longer period of time, this will this will bear fruit for your firm.
Yeah. You know, the other thing is, it's all about communication. When you have a plan that's been developed and that you know exactly the financial results you're trying to achieve, you know exactly how you're going to add value to your client relationships, you know what needs to be done to do those, you know what client profiles you're looking for, it becomes a matter of how do you communicate it, and are you communicating it consistently and in every medium that you're able to do that. I mean, advertising is about reach and frequency. And if you want to advertise that you're in the market to bring on candidates, know what your marketing message is. What's the value proposition? Why does it make sense for a candidate to join the firm? And do you have the objective evidence that you've built up to demonstrate that what your claims are about the firm are indeed true, because they can see the evidence of it? And then communicate that as much as you can. Maybe it goes in your client alerts. It's part of your annual report. It's talked about in each of the practice group meetings. Here's our update on, you know, our lateral recruiting efforts, and here, you know, here's our batting average and the kinds of laterals that we're looking for right now. The more it's communicated, the more it gets out in the marketplace. And you want it to get out organically. You want it to get out through your referral sources, through your partners, through your clients, because they know the firm, they know the culture of the firm, and they're going to bring better candidates to you by doing that. If you just advertise, you're going to get everybody who's really not the kind of attorney that's going to be a value add in the firm.
Steve, I've got a good question that came to me directly by iMessage. What's the best time for the LPQ to be sent to the candidate?
Right. All right. So that's a good question. And it goes to a little bit our idea of the two-step LPQ. I think the answer is not, it depends is the answer. I think that if your candidate's coming from a recruiter, I think you should send a short form due diligence probably after the first interview. Don't send it before the first interview. That would be, I think, bad form. It really shows that you're just interested in the numbers and not interested in the individual. But you want to be able to do it. Meet that person, figure out whether there's a fit, in terms of practice area, personality, all of that, the initial fit. What happens, I think our record is about 50% of the time, the first interview indicates that it doesn't make sense either from the client standpoint or the candidate standpoint. But from there on, at that point, assuming the situation I've raised before, I would send that first LPQ. If it's coming from the firm itself, like it's somebody, a partner has recommended somebody, and you're going after that partner, or the partner has actually done the initial outreach, I'd probably wait until you're further down the road, because this is somebody that you have some interest in, whether they come to your firm or not. And you got to be a little careful that you don't turn them off by giving them the book of business test right at the beginning. So it depends kind of situation, but it's really at a point where you feel comfortable where you ask that question. And the reality is, if you're dealing with a search firm, they should have most of that information available before they even present the candidate. I mean, you should have most of that information, in terms of what their billing rate is, what their book of business has been, et cetera. That should be part of the recruiter's responsibility. Yeah.
One other thing I failed to mention, but when I was in the process of doing the ALM study, after we went through all the material, we developed the process and we developed our findings and whatnot, I went back and looked at all the forms and templates and guides and what have you, and have developed several dozen different lateral recruiting forms. And a portion of those are on my illegal training website. There's a section called illegal forms. So if you're interested in looking at some template forms that are available, you can go to that, illegaltraining.com. Illegal forms is the tab. And if you're not seeing what you want, give me a call. There's a bunch that I have that are not posted. on that site, and oftentimes I can get you out what you need.
So there's another
All right.
question. And there's another question. Perhaps this is a great one for the whole another seminar, but it's about recruiting groups.
Yeah, there's certainly a more profitable and a better bet. And recruiting those groups, though, it's a lot harder. You've got to satisfy multiple motivations, and there's typically in any group a primary influencer. So your ability to understand who's really the influencer, and it may not be the practice group head or the person that comes to you, but who is the person that really carries weight and can influence opinions within that group. And understanding who that person is critical, because if they believe very strongly in making the move, you're gonna have an inside champion in the practice group.
Right. I would echo that thought. I think that it's important that you don't get focused so much on the group that you miss out on the opportunity. In other words, the group itself they're gonna have different points of view, and you can't start with the group. You have to start with an individual. You have to start with that person. Now, there are situations where there are preformed groups and they're out there, and they're usually, if they're a preformed group and they're looking to leave, they're either contacting firms directly or they're using a search firm to manage the process. So that is an area where the search firm, who is talent focused, can be helpful to your firm. So I don't want to discount that. But the idea is, if you're looking to recruit groups and you're recruiting, you're going to have to start with an individual, with the idea that once you bring that person in, you do raise the idea of, is there anybody else that we should be able to bring over that will help your practice? And make it about them. Don't make it about the group.
It looks like we're going over time. So, Steve, it's been fun presenting with you.
All right. Well,
and
thank
Dave,
you, everybody.
Thanks for your help.
Yeah. Thank you. Any questions, give us a call. Give us a call or send us an email, and we will get out to you shortly the slide deck, and then we will also have available the summary and the questionnaire. Thank you very much.
Good job, guys.